Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, Mal had his hands full with the guilt over hurting his family, working with John and his condition, and trying to keep him straight, as well as trying to become a songwriter. So let's see what he's up to today. When Mal returned to John and May's Gold Coast estate the following Saturday, he arrived with a purpose in his step. He had decided that today, April the 6th, 1974, would mark the end of his employment with the Beatles. It was time for him to make malcontent music a reality. Fran had been right all along, either put up or shut up. He needed to become a songwriter and talent scout in California or go back to Sunbury and the rabbit hutches. He was ready, finally, to elevate his own hopes and dreams above the Beatles' welfare. It was going to be hard for Mal to put aside the Beatles and his family for his own needs. He had made up his mind, so the only thing left for him to do was to inform the Beatles. His diary entry for the day spoke volumes in its simplicity. There would be no absent-minded doodles, no chit-chat about the weather. It was all business. Mal had brought Fran and Jody along for stability. Fran, though, expected to have a good time. She and her daughter would be spending quality time with the Beatle. To their surprise and delight, they would end up getting 3. As they strolled into the rented mansion, Mal caught sight of John and May, followed closely by Ringo. And not long afterwards, the McCartneys returned to the 625 Palisades Beach Road. For Mal, it was a godsend. At the same time, he had the most history with Paul, which upped the difficulty considerably. Mal comforted himself with the knowledge that by the day's end, the terrifying work of resigning from the Beatles would be largely complete. Gathering up his courage, Mal went to John first. To his relief, the Beatle was sitting alone by a table in the living room. I told him that I felt it was time for me to become my own person and do my own thing, Mal later recalled. He had to admit that doing his own thing wasn't entirely clear in that moment. For too long I had been resting on my laurels, he told John, not doing anything constructive for them nor for myself except on a personal level, and I would never stop doing that no matter what. And with that, Mal braced himself for John's reaction. John answered right away, saying, "It's about time, Mal. I was wondering when you'd come to it. You're certainly capable of standing on your own 2 feet now, and I wish you all the luck in the world. If you ever need me, I'll be there," he continued, "and I know your songwriting will develop into a career for you." Ringo's reaction was more difficult to gauge. In Mal's memory, the 2 old friends sat together at the bottom of the garden, just lying back in the sunshine. When Mal informed the drummer of his decision, Ringo went quiet. Paul was more receptive, taking Mal in a warm embrace and saying, "Good for you, lad. Good on you, lad. I know you'll be very successful. You deserve to be." For Mal, Paul's words were a welcome relief. After all, he had elevated Paul to a kind of hero status over the years. Later that night, as Mal shared Paul's reaction with Fran, he couldn't help but thinking about the time 4 years earlier, when after announcing the Beatles' disbandment, Paul told him, "I don't need you anymore." To Mal's mind, he had accomplished the same thing, telling the former bandmates one by one, "I don't need you anymore." The next day, Mal repeated the act with George, whom he telephoned at Friar Park. Mal didn't know what to expect. Busy conducting a recording session in his home studio with Splinter, George didn't have time for pleasantries. "So what?" he remarked, before hanging up and leaving Mal to contemplate the silence on the other end of the receiver. George held his doubts about Mal's capacity for actually leaving his employment with the Beatles. Mal suddenly found his self-confidence and took George's reaction in stride. For a moment, Mal's plans at making a friendly break from his old life seemed to be working. That Sunday evening, he and Fran joined John, May, and other friends for a seafood dinner at the Crab Shell, a bistro on Venice Beach. Harry Nielsen was there, of course. He confided that Ringo had stayed up with him, drinking well into the night and weeping as he took in the full measure of Mal's decision. Now that Mal's left, Ringo had cried to Harry, the Beatles are really over. Keith Moon was there, too. After dinner, he bought several rounds of Brandy Alexander's. Over drinks, Keith confided to Mal that he wanted to record a solo album, although nobody seemed to take him seriously as a frontman. As Mal listened, Keith got very emotional and was crying the blues, remarking that everybody is doing solo albums, even Ringo, and he's a drummer. I've been trying to do one for years, but no one will work with me because they think I'm crackers. Would you produce me, Mal?" Suddenly Mal had his first client, and true to his word, he began pursuing his post-Beatles life that Monday, when he kept an appointment with Wayne Berry, an LA songwriter who was hoping with Mal's guidance to land a deal with A&M Records. And then there was Wes Farrell. Back in the 1960s, Farrell had composed such hits as Boys with Luther Dixon, which had become a concert staple for Ringo during his Beatle days, and Hang On Sloopy, which had topped the American charts for the McCoys in 1965. But for Farrell, the 1970s had been lean, save for Come On Get Happy, the Partridge Family theme song. Hoping for a new beginning of his own, Farrell was looking to Mal as a potential songwriting partner to help restart his career. But by Tuesday afternoon, Beatle World had already managed to draw Mal back into the fold. It happened rather subtly at first, with Ringo asking Mal to round up some maracas and tambourines for an upcoming session. By the end of May, Mal was serving as Ringo's production assistant, stage managing his new LP, Goodnight Vienna, the much-anticipated follow-up to the drummer's blockbuster Ringo album. Richard Perry looked over the production at LA's Sunset Sound. Mal had easily slipped back into his old life, satisfying the Beatles' every whim, from tuning and prepping the instruments to hitting up the local bistros for late-night sandwiches and beverages. For Mal, the very idea of failing at his quest, of moving one step forward and two steps back, left him understandably melancholy. Outwardly, he remained determined to make his name as a songwriter, writing down lyrics in his diary and recording demos in his spare time. And on a positive note, his weekly wages never ended, lean as they were. He was living rent-free on 4th Street, and when he wasn't driving the Beatles and their friends around in rental cars, driving Fran's car free of charge. Inwardly, he knew the score. Undoing the Beatles spell would be no easy task. Mal consoled himself by thinking at least he had Fran. On May 27th, Memorial Day, Mal celebrated his 39th birthday. There was a seaside party hosted by Ringo, and he was nearly moved to tears when the drummer gifted him with a beautiful stone necklace. For her part, Fran presented her boyfriend with a Swiss Army knife, and to Mal's great joy, a Winchester repeating rifle. Ever since his target practice with Alan Parriser's Winchester in Malibu back in 1968, Mal had wanted one of his very own. Owning the rifle took Mal back to his simpler childhood times, a time when he was beholden to no one but his imagination, a world in which the pull of adult loyalties and obligations held little sway. But that was a long time ago. The gun Mal held in his hands in May 1974 was no pellet-firing toy. Fran's gift was the real deal. Fran said it was all good till it wasn't, which is kind of like life, and Mal and Fran had plenty of good times, especially when it came to John, May, and the folks at the Santa Monica estate. We were such a tight group, she recalled. We were always together. One of Fran's favorite memories involved the daily appearance of Baron von Moon, Keith's alter ego. As she and Mal lounged around the pool with the other, Baron von Moon would appear on the balcony, monocled and costumed in full-length leather coat, without trousers, greeting his fellow housemates with a fusillade of German. "Oh my God," said Fran, "the tears would be running down our faces." When they weren't hanging out with John, Harry, and the other rock and roll refugees, Mal and Fran enjoyed taking Jody to the beach. Santa Monica's Ocean Park was one of their favorite haunts. Mal had always had time for anything vaguely related to the Western lifestyle he so coveted. With Fran's blessing, he would take the Winchester out to the game lands and shoot at tin cans with Harry, George, or any number of friends who had an afternoon to kill. In addition to the 30-30 Winchester level-action rifle, Mal often went target shooting with his .22 Colt Woodsman pistol. He and Fran also enjoyed horseback riding, with Mal wearing his wide-brimmed cowboy hat to get into character. During one unforgettable Mother's Day, they went riding in remote Beechwood Canyon, with a Hollywood sign looming above them. Before they left the stables, Fran had been given a stern warning about her horse, which hadn't been rain-broken. Fran, being a daredevil, went anyway. falling off the untamed animal and breaking her collarbone. As she lay immobilized on the trail, even Mal couldn't rescue her. Eventually, she had to be airlifted out of the canyon. Another time, Fran remembered that they were at the beach in Malibu. We were watching this whole scene unfold, which we felt was made up of people and stuff. But then later we realized it was just birds that we had been seeing, not tourists milling around the beach. We were that messed up. Then there were times when Mal would get drunk and fall into a depression, often taking Valium to soothe his aching conscience and get some sleep. Mal would then become crestfallen about being torn between his family back in England and staying in L.A. with me, Fran recalled. In those moments, life just got too hard for him. But as soon as other people would come around, he had the ability to morph into this happy-go-lucky person, no matter what was happening in his life. So I will end the video here. We see in this episode, Mal had the idea he was going to put the Beatles behind him, but it was easier said than done. He found that they held too much power over him, and Ringo was the first to break through and get Mal back into the Beatle life. At the same time, Mal was working on being a songwriter, and he was working with a few other guys in the music business, trying to make things happen. But in the meantime, he and Fran were kind of overdoing it when they thought they were seeing people, but they were really birds at the beach. That was kind of rough. And then Mal would go into a melancholy about his family and start drinking, but he was able to turn his personality around as soon as other people appeared. So he was having a kind of tough time in this episode too. But I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.